Well, I think we'll get going and we'll let a few more trickle in as we go, as is usually the way. So thank you for coming out tonight. Apologies to those of you who have heard this spiel before, but this is how we start all of our webinars. So thank you for coming out to what is actually the fifth talk of this series, which seems kind of crazy. We're in November already. And it's a follow-up for those of you who aren't aware to a spring webinar series we did about bird ID in Newfoundland. So now we're taking a little bit of a deeper dive, and we are really excited to host researchers who are talking about the amazing work that they're doing on Newfoundland birds. So for those of you who I haven't met, I'm Catherine Dale. I'm coordinator of the Newfoundland Breeding Bird Atlas. And with us tonight is also Jenna McDermott, who's the assistant coordinator. She currently reads as Birds Canada Atlantic, but she does actually have a name. And both Jenna and I work for Birds Canada, which is a nationwide charitable organization whose mission is to advance the understanding, appreciation, and conservation of wild birds and their habitats. So no small mission, and obviously it's a big project to undertake, and one of the main ways we do this is by running many different citizen science programs across the country. So that is programs that rely on volunteers, people like you who are interested in birds and excited about them, participating, signing up and collecting data and submitting it to our online database. And there's no way that we could do the work that we do without the more than 70,000 volunteers who engage in our programs each year, which is really incredible. Sydney, you look surprised. So I was surprised too by that number. It's amazing. We're relative newcomers here in Newfoundland. So we have two programs currently running. The first is the Newfoundland Breeding Bird Atlas. So that is our main project, what Jenna and I spend most of our time on. And it is a 5-year citizen science effort to map the distribution and the abundance of all of the species of birds that breed on the island of Newfoundland. So the map that you see there is for the northern water thrush in the picture, and those squares are all places where water thrush have been reported. It's a 5-year project, and we've just finished year 3 of 5, so there's still lots of time to get involved if you're interested. And our second Newfoundland program is the Nocturnal Owl Survey. It's a little bit different. This takes place in a very limited time span between April 1st and May 15th each year. And essentially, it involves citizen scientists going out to predetermined routes with 10 stops and driving those stops and listening for owls along the way. This is a great survey for beginners because we actually don't have that many nocturnal owls in Newfoundland, so it's very easy to learn their songs. And both programs, we're always looking for new volunteers. So if this is something that you're interested in, feel free to send us an email or look us up online. Jenna, if you could put the Atlas email in the chat, that would be great. And finally, before I pass it over to tonight's speaker, I would just like to thank all of our partners and funders. So the Atlas is a huge program. It kind of takes a village to make it happen. And if it weren't for the support of all of these organizations, we wouldn't be able to do the project or offer these free workshops. And thanks also to you guys, because I see lots of the same names there again. So it's great that people keep coming out week after week. Okay, and so I'm just going to introduce our speaker and pass it over to her. So I'm really excited to welcome Sydney Collins. Sydney is originally from Ontario, and she did an undergraduate degree at University of Guelph. I happen to have grown up near Guelph, so I know that it is an amazing school for biology. And I think it sort of sparked her interest in seabirds because for her honors thesis, she got to study personality in black-legged kittiwakes in Alaska. So we do have kittiwakes here. Maybe she'll give us a few tips on learning about personality of our kittiwakes. So she's currently a PhD student at Memorial University. She works with Dave Wilson and Bill Montevecchi. And tonight she's going to be telling us about the work that she's doing with Leach's storm-petrels, which is a species you may remember from the very first talk of this series. So Sydney, I'm going to stop sharing and pass it over to you now.
Great, thanks, Catherine. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yep, we can hear you.
Great. All right. So yeah, as Catherine said, I'm Sydney. I'm a PhD student at MUN, and I'm super excited to be here. Thank you so much for having me. I am absolutely in love with Leach's storm-petrels, and I can't stop talking about them. They are so fun, and I really hope you enjoy hearing about them today. So this is a little bit about my master's work that I finished up a little while ago. and my PhD currently is an extension of my master's work, and I'll get into a little bit about what I'm doing with that right now. But I'm currently in the early stages of my PhD, so I don't have too much to tell you about that. But the idea is stemmed from the work that I'll be talking about right now. So in case you missed Laura's talk at the beginning, I'm just going to talk a little bit about storm petrels and generally where they are and what they're like. So storm petrels have a really, really expansive range. This is a range map from the Birds of the World. And the blue area is everywhere that they go. So you can see that that's pretty much most of the ocean in the Northern Hemisphere. And the orange dots that you can see in there are all of the places where storm petrels are sighted on land where they breed. And so you can see there's a really big cluster of all of those right around Newfoundland. And Newfoundland is actually where the largest number of breeding storm petrels exist. And Leach's storm petrels are actually the most abundant breeding seabird in Newfoundland. It's not the puffin, it's actually the storm petrel. So it's really exciting to be studying this seabird because not a lot of people know about them, despite the fact that there are so many of them here. Now, even though there are a ton of them, they're actually experiencing a really, really massive decline. They've lost about 54% of their population in Atlantic Canada in just 3 generations, which is only 44 years. So that's really fast. There's a bunch of different reasons why this might be happening. One of them is pollution. Leach's storm petrels have among the highest known concentrations of mercury in their blood, and most Leach's storm petrel stomachs that have been looked at have a lot of traces of plastic in them. Climate and fishing is also causing a big problem, where increased climate is causing a decline in a lot of the fish that they like to eat. Habitat change can also be a big issue, where destruction of their breeding habitat is causing a loss of places where they can build their nests. There's also a lot of predation happening. Birds like gulls are a big predator of Leach's storm petrels, and a lot of gulls are increasing because they're able to feed on things like fishing discards and garbage. And so there's a lot of predators around for the Leach's storm petrel. And another one is light attraction. Like a lot of different seabirds, Leach's storm petrels are attracted to anthropogenic light, and this can cause a lot of problems, especially because anthropogenic light is increasing around the planet. This is an extremely widespread phenomenon and is receiving a lot of research attention, and it's what I'm going to be focusing on in this presentation. So just a bit about these super cute birds. They are really tiny. They only grow to be about 45 grams. You can see that they're about the size of my hand, and I have pretty small hands. Just to give you a bit of a reference, they're about the size of a robin. So, you know, for a seabird, that's pretty small. They do, however, have extremely long wings. Their wings can be 16 centimeters long, which is longer than their entire body. And you can kind of see how impressively long their wings are in that picture on the left there. These amazing birds can also live for 15 to 30 years. So they're extremely long-lived. I'm about 25, so it's pretty amazing to see that some of the birds that I hold in my hand might be older than I am. These birds also lay just 1 egg per year, and they breed in burrows. And so it's really important that these birds are reproductively successful every year, because otherwise they're not going to be able to have a sustainable population. Now, I just want to give a little bit of a shout out to storm petrel chicks. Like I said, they just have 1 of them a year, and they are super cute and very vocal and super soft. And I love working with them. I got to focus on the adults for my research for this particular study, but I just wanted to show you all just how wonderful they are. Seeing them and holding these birds really even emphasizes to me that they really need conserving because they're just so special. Now, as I said before, these birds breed in burrows, and they breed on colonies. These colonies can range in size from, tens of pairs to millions of pairs. And some of the colonies that are in Newfoundland are the largest in the world. Baccalieu Island has about 3 million pairs of storm petrels. And then in the Witless Bay Ecological Reserve, where I did my work, there's about 500,000 storm petrels in that area. These birds travel really, really far out to sea to catch fish for their chick. You can see from this map here that they're flying all the way out to past the Grand Banks into where the Flemish Cap and the Flemish Pass is. And these birds feed on myctophids, which are bioluminescent fish that only live in this area. So that's why they have to fly so far. And to give you an idea of just how far this is, this particular bird flew about 1,000 kilometers out one way to go and catch these fish. So this round trip is just under 2,000 kilometers. And they do this over the course of just 3 days. And they do this all year for the entire breeding season, which is from about May to October. So these are some extremely hardworking parents. Now, as they fly out, they actually pass over these oil platforms that are on the Grand Banks. And you can see that some of these storm petrels might really closely associate with these oil platforms. And this is a big problem because these oil platforms are extremely brightly lit. And like I said before, a lot of seabirds, including Leach's storm petrels, are attracted to these oil platforms. Now, this is a map here of the light environment of Newfoundland. Now, these data were actually collected in 2012, but I don't think that there's been too much of a change in the light environment since then, other than things getting brighter. And you can just see how bright these oil platforms are in comparison to St. John's even. They're just as bright and just as glaring. And this is a picture that was taken from space. So really you can see why these birds might have such an attraction to these giant, massively, very brightly lit platforms in the middle of an ocean that used to be completely dark. Now, there's a bunch of problems with the storm petrels being attracted to these oil platforms. They can fatally collide with the structure. They can become disoriented or lost when they're caught in the light. They can be exposed to increased predation. So when they're in this environment where it was previously dark, other things aggregate around these oil platforms too, like gulls, which are their main predator. And these bright lights make the storm petrels easier to see, so they might get killed just by gulls by being around this platform. They'll sometimes circle around lights, and so this can result in a lot of additional energy expenditure. These oil platforms will also give off these massive gas flares, and the storm petrels might fly into them, causing them to be incinerated, which is a pretty unfortunate end for those birds. And if they land on the platform itself, they could be oiled or injured by the machinery. Now, when we talk about light, we often talk about the light catch basin. And this is a really important concept. This is the distance away from a source that the light can be seen. Now, if the birds can see the light, we assume that they might be attracted to this light. And for these oil platforms on the Grand Bank, there was a paper that was recently published that actually was able to quantify this light catch basin, which is really fantastic. This paper was written by Karina Jerdrum et al., and they found that on average for this for the platforms on the Grand Bank, the average light catch basin is about 10.7 kilometers in a radius. And so that's actually pretty enormously far. These little tiny platforms can be seen from 11 kilometers away. So you can see why these might be a problem for birds that are passing through. So when we're talking about where birds go, one of the main tools that we use is called kernel home density analysis. And this basically answers the question of where is the animal most likely to be. So to give you an example of this, I just made a kernel home density map for myself. So this is everywhere that I've been on the Avalon Peninsula. In this green circle, I've been most of the places on the Avalon Peninsula now, either just driving through or visiting or looking at birds. And so yes, this green circle is everywhere that I have been. And you usually have a 95% chance of finding me somewhere in this green circle. I'm often in this yellow circle. I live in St. John's and I like to go birding up and down along the southern coast there. So you probably have about a 75% chance of finding me there because I spend a lot more time in that area. And this red circle is telling you where I usually am. I live in St. John's, so it's likely that you're going to find me in St. John's, but I also work in Witless Bay, so you probably have a pretty good chance of finding me in Witless Bay during the summers. And just to point out the percentages here, because I know that this can get confusing, The higher the percentage, the more likely you are to find me in that area, but also that's because it's a larger area. So here are some real kernel home density analyses of Leach's storm-petrels from around Newfoundland and Nova Scotia. And the red circle there and the black circle is showing you two of the colonies in Newfoundland, Baccalieu Island and Gull Island. And you can see in those home ranges, the circles there, that they do overlap with the oil platforms on the Grand Banks. Now, that previous study was done only for tracks that were collected during incubation. Incubation is when the birds are sitting on the eggs. Now, chicks are really hard work and require a lot of energy, so we might expect that the storm-petrels could have different behaviors in terms of where they're going during the chickering period. We also do know that for some procelariforms, which are what storm-petrels are, this includes things like albatrosses and shearwaters, some procelariforms do change their behavior within the breeding season. We also know that storm-petrels may have constraints on their trip structure. Leach's storm-petrels are nocturnal at the colony, so they're only active at night. They only leave and come back to their burrow at night. And their main predators, like herring gulls, are active during the day, so this further constrains the storm-petrels to be active at the colony at night, otherwise they're going to get caught by a gull. Storm-petrels also primarily feed on nocturnal fish. Those myctophids that I was talking about earlier are bioluminescent, and they're only available at the surface of the water at night. So that's when storm-petrels have to be there to be able to feed on them. So what this means is that storm-petrels might be constrained to travel at specific times. So to summarize all of this, we know that seabirds are vulnerable to fatal light attraction, and we know that Leach's storm-petrels in Newfoundland are exposed to this risk, at least during incubation. But what we don't know is how serious and how consistent is the risk. So I sought to answer these questions on Gull Island in the Witless Bay Ecological Reserve in Newfoundland. Gull Island and this ecological reserve altogether is about the second largest colony of Leach's storm-petrels in the world. Gull Island hosts about 175,000 pairs, so it's pretty storm-petrel-y there for sure. It's a really, really beautiful place as well. There's a lot of boat tours that go out around the island. Storm-petrels are nocturnal, so you probably won't get to see them, but if you ever do get a chance to visit this beautiful place, I highly recommend it. So I studied these using what are currently the world's smallest GPS devices that we can put on birds. These GPSs that you can see in that picture there just weigh 1 gram each, and the battery can last for about 2 weeks, and they can collect maybe 300 points. So it is pretty remarkable that technology has evolved enough to give us a device that's like, as powerful as this one is, and that allows us to study these questions in birds that are as small as storm-petrels are. In collaboration with Environment and Climate Change Canada, we put these devices out from 2016 to 2021, and we put them out during both chickering and incubation. Altogether, we managed to put out and get back devices from 85 birds. This resulted in 212 total trips, and we had about a 70% recapture rate. So not every single device that we put out, we get back again. But the 85 trips and the 85 birds and the 212 trips makes this the largest sample size of its kind in the world. So I'm extremely proud that I managed to accomplish that for my master's. That's very, very exciting to me. I analyzed these data for a whole bunch of things, including the behavior at each point. So whether the bird was foraging, actively trying to find and locate and then eat food, or whether the bird was transiting, so just flying to and from a specific direction without actually doing anything. I was looking at the core foraging area of these birds using the kernel home density analysis that we talked about before. I also looked at the consistency in the behavior and trip structure of the storm-petrels, and I did this looking at range overlap and with statistical models. And I looked at the proximity to and behavior near the oil platforms using statistical models again. So these are the overall utilization distributions of the storm-petrels for the entire study. Now, just to recap this a little bit, the purple one there is where we found the greatest frequency of birds. So in that purple circle, that's where you're most likely to find storm petrels from Gull Island. In the 95% circle, that's where pretty much all of the birds were for the entire time. And the interesting one here is that teal circle, that's the 64% utilization distribution. And I know that that's kind of a weird number, but what that is it's the smallest percentage utilization distribution that contained all of the oil platforms. And so generally what this is telling us is in the same conclusion as that previous study, storm petrels are likely to be near oil platforms. So I analyzed each point for the behaviors, and directing your attention here to map A, the pink and dark purple points are representing areas where the storm petrels were foraging, and the light cream points are representing areas where the storm petrels were transiting. And transiting was defined as individuals moving very quickly in a straight direction. So they weren't dilly-dallying around, they were really moving to and from a place. And if we break that down more and look at map B, I made the utilization distributions based on the specific behaviors there, and you can see that they are pretty separate, and that the transiting locations are the only ones that overlapped with the oil platforms. So generally what that meant is that storm petrels tended to be transiting when they were moving past the oil platforms. Foraging generally occurred around the Flemish Cap off of the Grand Bank there. The other interesting thing about this is that the overall overlap among individuals, the areas that individuals used, was low. And so looking at graph A, you can tell because there's this one individual up at the top there that went way, way the heck up north and nobody else did. And then there were other individuals that went really, really south and nobody else did. So there was quite a lot of difference between individuals in the areas that they used. So I looked at the annual and seasonal differences in the transiting and the foraging locations. And for transiting, I didn't find that there were any differences either between among years or between chick rearing and incubation. So the areas that they used to transit were consistent, and these were the areas in which they tended to overlap with the oil platforms. We have a different story for incubation, however. While there were no real differences between the different years, we did find a distinct difference between incubation and chick rearing. The trips for incubation were about 8 hours longer than the trips were for chick rearing, and the incubating birds tended to go further off of the Grand Bank and forage further out at sea. So their trips were further and longer. It's also important to point out here that these areas where they were foraging didn't actually tend to overlap with the oil platforms. So they didn't really forage near oil platforms is what I'm trying to get at here. So looking more into detail about their association with oil platforms now, we found that the mean minimum distance that a bird was from an oil platform was 64.6 kilometers. And now this might sound really far, but this was actually an extremely wide range. It ranged from just 0.3 kilometers to almost 300 kilometers away as the closest distance that they were to the oil platform on that trip. So there were some birds that practically flew right over top of the oil platform and some birds that were absolutely nowhere near it. The birds flew within the light catch basin of the oil platforms in 17.5% of trips, but they flew in the light catch basin at night in 1.1% of trips. And this is an important distinction because if you think about a light, you're going to be able to see it a lot better when there's no other light around. And so currently we think that light attraction is more of a problem at night. And that's why it's interesting to think about Leach's storm petrels being nocturnal at the colony and nocturnal at the feeding ground. It seems like they're moving between where they need to be nocturnal to be in the burrow and where they need to be nocturnal to feed. They're moving between these two spaces during the day, which means that they tend to be going past these oil platforms during the day, which seems to be reducing their overall risk from these oil platforms. These birds were also transiting when flying past the oil platforms in 71.9% of trips. So that meant that they didn't spend very much time near the oil platforms at all. In fact, they spent an average of 21 minutes within the oil platform catch basin. And this ranged from 6 minutes to 3.4 hours, depending on the behavioral state, which implies the different transit speeds. So for birds that were transiting, the average was around 6 minutes. For birds that were potentially like feeding or resting near the oil platforms, they could have spent upwards of 3 hours in the proximity. But it seems like most of the birds that did actually fly within the lake catch basin were spending about 20 minutes in that area. And considering it's about 11 kilometers, that's they're moving pretty quickly through there. The odds that a bird was going to fly through an oil platform also didn't vary with year. It didn't vary between the breeding phases, and it didn't vary whether it was passing by during the night or day. So even though we did find this difference in the foraging ranges for individuals during chick rearing and incubation, we didn't find that this altered how at risk they were to exposure to these oil platforms. Sorry, just gonna take a drink of water now. So to summarize all of this, we found consistent foraging behavior and risk exposure among years, but the foraging behavior was different within years between incubation and chick rearing. We also found that adult Leach's storm-petrels usually transited past the oil platforms during the day, which means that the exposure duration and proportion of individuals that were exposed were low. This was 21 minutes, and 1.1% of the trips they flew within the lake catch basin at night. However, the individuals tended to forage in different places, so there may be individual differences in risk exposure. Also, 30% of the birds were not recaptured, so the actual risk could be much higher. We have no idea what the fate of those 30% of birds actually is, so it is possible that these birds died on that oil platform, and we just don't know. The risk from the oil platforms may also be higher for other groups, like juveniles or recent fledglings, or at other times of the year, like during the winter. And so overall, we recommend that we focus research and conservation efforts throughout the year. Now, I told you I was going to talk a little bit about my plans for my PhD, and this point in the middle there is exactly what I'm trying to pursue for my PhD. I am curious to see if individual differences in behavior relate to individual differences in risk exposure. So what I'm trying to do is investigate individual consistency in foraging patterns in Leach's storm-petrels at Gull Island. And so what that means is that I now need to try and find the 85 storm-petrels from this study and put a GPS on them again. And that's not super easy to do. It's possible because the birds return to the same burrow every year, usually. They don't always though, so that makes it a little bit hard. And I've done this for 19 birds so far, so that's pretty good. That was sort of like 1.5 years of effort. So after the next couple of years, hopefully I'll be able to increase that sample size a little bit. The logic behind all of this is that if individual storm-petrels consistently go to the same place, then they will be consistently exposed to the risks that are concentrated within that area. And this means that we can refine conservation measures to specific areas that these individual storm-petrels consistently use. If you have a group of individuals that are always going around the Flemish Cap, and then you have a different group of individuals that are going up to the Orphan Basin, then we know to look at risks that are present in both the Flemish Cap and in the Orphan Basin. So I have to thank so many people for all of the efforts that they have put into all of this. Thank you so much to all of my research assistants, to my many, many field assistants, some of whom are not mentioned there. A lot of people have come out to help me with this, and even more people came out to help me continue this project for my PhD this year. So thank you so much to all of them. Thank you also to my important contributors, the people who helped me write this paper, who helped me with my master's and who are continuing to help me during my PhD. And also thank you to NSERC, Environment Canada, and Memorial University for funding this research. The GPSs are really very cool technology, but they're pretty expensive. So I really appreciate the help with that. Thank you so much, all of you, for watching my talk. You're all welcome to reach out to me via email or over Twitter, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. I really appreciate it so much, and thank you for listening to me today.
Thanks, Sydney. That was great and super interesting. Yeah, if you have questions, you can either unmute yourselves and just ask them, or you can put them in the chat. We do have one question in the chat already, so I'll start with that. And if people have other questions, please feel free to jump in. So Carrie asked whether the oil platforms have cameras that could maybe capture seabird activity. She also said it was a great talk, so thank you for the talk.
Thank you, Gary. That's a great question. There's a lot of initiatives going on right now to try and monitor the seabirds that are landing on oil platforms. It's pretty hard to do, to be honest. A lot of oil platforms are not super willing to work with us. And so you kind of have to take roundabout measures in order to look at these seabirds associations with these oil platforms, like the measures that I had to take here. I think that there are new there's new legislature that's gone through that's requiring seabird observers on exploratory drilling platforms. So these are going to be trained observers that are going to be sent out on these platforms in order to specifically figure out which birds are landing there, how many, and when. So these kinds of questions are going to be easier to answer with that, but it's very slow progress in terms of all of that. And then trying to get access to the security footage and that kind of thing on those platforms is really up to the company's discretion, and a lot of the time their discretion is to not share them with us. So we're doing our best, but it's not always super easy to work with the companies in terms of conservation.
I can see how that would be the case, yes. Are there things that oil platforms could do to mitigate the risk that they pose to seabirds?
Yes, absolutely. I think one of the things that we're looking into, because this is not just a problem on oil platforms, light attraction is a problem everywhere, really. There's a large number of birds that are stranding in coastal towns and near fish plants along the coast. And so some of the different measures that we're implementing there is just simply turning off the lights when they're not needed. One of the studies that I'm a part of right now actually is finding that that is very effective. Even though that might seem silly, it seems to dramatically reduce the number of birds that are being attracted to that area. So that's one measure. I know for safety reasons, it's not always possible to turn off all the lights. I totally appreciate that. So something else we're trying to look into right now is to figure out what specific colors might be the most attractive to birds, and then try and avoid those. It seems like, based on my personal experience, it seems like storm-petrels aren't attracted to red light. So a potential option could be swapping out some of these really bright white LED lights for red lights, because that's going to still shed enough light for safety reasons, but would definitely reduce the light catch basin and would reduce the attractiveness to storm-petrels. There's also a whole bunch of other things that you can do to the actual lamp itself. You can shield it so that it's not projecting up, so that the light catch basin is reduced. You can also just swap out the type of light that they're using. It seems like metal halide lights sodium lights seem to be better than LEDs in terms of how attractive they are. But there's a lot of research going into this to figure out exactly what we can do to reduce this. And I'm hoping that it's going to be as simple as just swapping out a light bulb, but I think the problem is a lot more complicated than that.
Isn't it always? We have another question in the chat here, which actually kind of overlaps with a question that I had, which is, as you pointed out, a kind of a limitation of your study is you can only look at the movement patterns of the birds that come back. And so you have no idea what happened to the birds that don't come back. So it seems that if there's any way to move from some kind of, from the archival record collection to transmitting technology, that could benefit you hugely. And so I wondered about Icarus tags, although we don't know if Icarus will ever actually get up and going at this point. But Bruce has asked whether MODIS technology on platforms could track individuals possibly approaching the platforms, whether you could triangulate with multiple MODIS towers, and you could distinguish between adults and immatures. So you could maybe get at a lot of questions that way.
That is a great question. A massive pilot study of that was undertaken a few years ago, and there's quite a few issues with that. So we thought about it, and it would be awesome, but it doesn't seem overly feasible. The main reason is because just being allowed to install the MODIS towers on the oil platforms, I don't know if they would allow that, so we would probably have to set up our own like buoys that can have a MODIS tower on them, and then trying to actually get to them and maintain them would be really hard. The other problem with specifically MODIS tags is the antenna is extremely long, and storm petrels are burrowing birds. And so you have to make sure that the antenna is not so long that it's going to snap the tag off of them when they're trying to turn around in their burrow. You can trim the tag or trim the antenna, but then that does reduce how far the storm petrels can be detected away from. So they would have to be really, really close to the tower in order for us to be able to detect them. And then just being able to have the tags stay on the birds seems to be a bit of an issue. These tags, the method that we use to attach them is intended to allow the tag to fall off. We deploy the tag for about 2 weeks, and I have recaptured a tag the following year. I actually did that for the first time this year. It was very exciting. But in most cases, the tag itself will fall off, which is good because the tag is 1 gram, which is about 2.5 to 3% of the storm petrel's body weight. And we want to try and minimize the tag weight as much as possible, because we don't actually know what the effects of having this extra weight on them are causing to these storm petrels. In my study, I didn't actually find any difference in the change in mass of the adults from those birds that were tagged and those birds that were not. So that was good. But, you know, there could be other effects that we didn't check for, that we don't know to check for. So really, we're trying to minimize the impact as much as possible. And the antennas are like multiple times longer than the whole bird. So it's kind of, it's not really possible for a bird that has to turn around in a very narrow burrow. I can only just fit my arm down a lot of them. So they're pretty narrow burrows, yeah.
That makes a lot of sense, and that's not a constraint that I had thought about. Just out of curiosity, do you know what the weight of the lightest transmitting GPS tag would be?
The ones that I know of are 10 or 15 grams.
Oh
So
yeah, that's not going to cut it, is
we're
it?
way off, unfortunately. Yeah.
Yeah, we got to wait till those Icarus tags become functional.
That's my dream. I cannot wait. My ideal tag for a storm petrel would be solar powered and transmitting, and then I would be able to track them for so long. It would be amazing.
We'll learn so much if the system ever becomes fully operational.
Yeah.
Another question here from Kristen. She says, as a GPS enthusiast, she was wondering if you could go a bit more into detail about how you assessed behavior from the movement patterns, so foraging versus commuting or transiting.
Sure. Hi, Kristen. I think I know what Kristen that is. Nice to see you. Yes, so I used hidden Markov models, and essentially hidden Markov models look at the relationship between subsequent points. They're looking at the turning angle and the distance between each point in order to sort of assign a behavior. So what it does is it's using k-means clustering to look at the different types of turning angles and step lengths in between each point to group them into different groups. And so in my paper, I chose 3 behaviors. So 3 clusters. There were 3 reasons for that. There were 2 reasons for that. The first one is because 3 behaviors is just what's most commonly observed in seabirds when they're using this technique to assess their behavior. And also because a 3-state model was a better model than a 2-state model. And so you kind of have to interpret what those behaviors are. So that was one of the challenges of this, is we had to look at the step lengths and turning angles in those particular groups, the means of the step lengths and turning angles, and kind of guess what the behavior was. So the transiting one was pretty easy because it had very narrow turning angles. So the birds were mostly moving straight, and very long step lengths. So basically they were just going straight there and straight back. The smallest, the behavior that we called resting, although it could be just actively feeding or digesting or whatever that behavior is, that was characterized by very sharp turning angles and very short step lengths. So they had a lot more of that haphazard type behavior. And then the middle one we were calling active search. So that was characterized by moderate step lengths and moderate turning angles. And so the we think that the birds were sort of locating an area, flying around it, trying to hone in on that food source. One of the drawbacks of my data set is because these GPSs are, they're really smart, but they're not as smart as I'd like. So we're limited by the memory and the battery life, which meant that I could only collect a point every 2 hours. So trying to infer what those behaviors are is actually pretty difficult, because it's totally possible that the birds were doing a whole bunch of things in that time interval. But this is really the best that we can do with the technology that we have. So as the technology improves, we're going to be able to get a lot more like fine resolution of what their behaviors are. Although it was looking, it seemed very logical as well, where they were transiting and where they were foraging based on the output of the hidden Markov models. We were also looking at how this varied with time of day and bathymetry. Those were some covariates in the model, and that helped make it even better and made us more confident in our behavioral assessments. But yeah, I mean, in my wish list of things for future GPS technology, I'd love to have GPSs that have a lot more memory, so that we can have more than 2 hours, less than 2 hours in between each point.
Yep. Limited by technology, right?
Yes.
Although, when you think about how far we've come, how quickly.
Yeah, the fact that this study is even possible is extremely exciting. This technology is pretty new, and the government started putting it out pretty much as soon as they could get their hands on it. And then as soon as I got here, I started putting them out in collaboration with them, and we managed to get really a pretty awesome data set. So I am really excited to see in 10 years, if someone repeats this study, how much better it is than mine.
Technology, still, your sample size is fantastic.
Yeah, we were very, very lucky. Yeah.
So we've got another great job from another Sydney.
Thank you.
But does anyone have any more questions for Sydney before we let her off the hot seat?
I just have a quick question. It's Jenna here. So if they're taking, I think you said like a 3-day journey out and back to get food for their chicks, does that mean a chick is only getting fed like once every other day?
Yes, sometimes it's even less than that even. It doesn't seem like the parents coordinate very much. That's actually one of the things I'm looking at for my PhD. So the 3 days is kind of the average, but the trips can be as long as 5 or 6 days. So yes, the chicks do just kind of hang out in the burrow without food for a really long time. These birds are really good at fasting for long periods of time. The adults will sit in the burrow without eating for 3 to 5 days while they're incubating the egg or the chick. So that is it is quite remarkable that they can last that long without food. Yeah.
Yeah, wow, that's crazy. Thank you.
I definitely couldn't. I'd be demanding food.
Me too.
I have one more question before we let you go, and just to give everybody a chance to think of any others. I was curious, so, I mean, I've heard, particularly working with Laura Tranquilla, who coordinates a lot of the petrel research in the Atlantic region, I've heard a lot about the massive decline on Baccalieu Island.
Yeah.
And I've heard about declines in Witless Bay, but I noticed that some of your Nova Scotia colonies also seem to overlap with what I think were oil platforms. I only saw that map really quickly. And I was just wondering about population trends at some of the other colonies.
Yeah, good question. Let me see if I can find that map now. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I might have imagined it. It was, there we go. There were some black X's just off the coast of Nova Scotia, around Sable Island, I think.
Yeah, so the general trend in Atlantic Canada is that everybody's declining. That's where the 54% number comes from. This is in contrast to the Pacific colonies, which actually seem to be doing really well. So I don't know about each specific individual colony and how they're doing, but I think in general, everybody's having a terrible time, which is unfortunate. I know that Baccalieu, because it's the largest colony, has received a lot of attention because I think it's about 50% of the population in Atlantic Canada is on Baccalieu. It might be even more than that. I'm misremembering the numbers at the moment, but because that colony is so such a significant proportion of this whole population, the fact that that one is declining at such an alarming rate is really receiving a lot of research attention, because that colony seems to be the one that is going to be really important for maintaining the population, especially because storm petrel chicks don't generally return to the same colony. They might go to any of these colonies. So Baccalieu is kind of the chick machine that's trying to keep the population afloat.
Right, it's the source for all of the sinks. I realize that this would be majorly correlative, but if light attraction is a huge problem, could you not look at the population trends in colonies that do have foraging ranges that overlap with oil platforms and then don't? Because it does look like you've got some variation there.
I think you absolutely could. I think studying these different colonies and their population trends, it's pretty hard to study the population trends of storm petrels because they're burrowing birds and because they're nocturnal. So
and
it's
they're
not quite so
long-lived on top of it, so it's not like you could do it for a PhD.
Yeah, right, exactly. So trying to study that is pretty complex. I know that we have a pretty good comprehensive idea of the population trends for some of the colonies, but not all of them. Like I said, I am not super familiar with all of the exact numbers for all of the colonies. There's about 90 of them. So I know a lot about Gull Island and a good bit about Baccalieu, but the rest of the colonies, I think there's definitely some knowledge gaps there for my own personal knowledge, but also just in general. And that's ongoing research that's happening with the Storm Petrel Working Group in Atlantic Canada. So hopefully we'll be able to answer some of those questions. I think an interesting point that you raised there as well is the different risks that we think these storm petrels are exposed to are going to be very colony specific. Some populations are exposed to the oil platforms, whereas others probably are not. And so when you're trying to come up with a comprehensive conservation strategy for these birds, it's really hard to just say, okay, we need to turn off all of the lights at oil platforms. Well, maybe that'll solve a problem for a small proportion of the birds at Gull Island, because I found that a very small proportion of them actually interacted with it. But that's not going to be super helpful for Miquelon, which is that yellow colony there. So it really, or that might be St. Pierre and Miquelon. But so it really, it really depends on the colony. And so trying to get at light attraction is just one piece of the big puzzle.
Right. Yep. No, that makes sense. We do have a couple more questions for you. So Bruce wanted to know if there are any associations found between level of contamination in petrels and their foraging behavior.
Oh, great question. I don't know if that's been studied yet. It seems right now that the general consensus is that mercury poisoning or mercury contamination levels in petrels are not impacting their survival and reproductive success, as far as we know. It would be super interesting to look at the mercury levels in relation to their foraging behavior. This is like I said, this paper that I came out with is the largest sample size of its kind, and this is just on this one colony. Mercury levels also differ pretty dramatically among colonies, so that would kind of be an interesting thing to study on a very large scale, which you would need a pretty enormous sample size to look at that. So that would definitely be a cool thing to look into in the future.
Could be very neat, especially if you find that individuals are very consistent in their foraging behavior.
Yeah, I don't know yet. I'm looking forward to finding out if they are.
Absolutely. And one last question, whether these birds are often found near the town of Grand Bank. So I'm guessing that refers to the Middle Lawn colony there on the Burin.
Oh, I don't know about Grand Banks specifically. There's a lot of storm-petrels stranding in all of these different towns. Another project that I'm working on right now is using citizen reports to try and figure out where all of these birds are stranding around the island. Because the reality is Newfoundland is really huge and there's millions of storm-petrels all around the island. And so for just me and my research team to try and track where these birds are and where they're ending up is impossible. So trying to look at all of these different reports from people is actually extremely helpful. So if you do see a storm petrel, it would be awesome if you could like tweet it to me or contact Bill Montevecchi or report it on eBird, because these are some really invaluable pieces of data that are allowing us to kind of try and figure out the scope of the problem for light attraction around Newfoundland for these birds.
And that seems like a great note to end on, because you've reinforced the importance of citizen science and the ability of citizens collaborating to cover a much larger area. So it seems like a good note to end an Atlas sponsored presentation on.
Well, thank you very much. I was really, really happy to be here.
Thank you, Sydney. We really appreciated it. And thank you guys all for coming out tonight. Have a great week, and we will be back again next week with another seminar, actually this time given by our own Jenna McDermott, who's going to tell us all about gray-cheeked thrush.